Okay, it seems like we have more and more people to join us today. That is great. Maybe I will start to have the introduction of today's webinar. So today is our May webinar from our CIT Northern Alberta section. And my name is Zheng Luo, and I'm the current president of NACITE. And today's topic is about moving beyond theory, how to apply and integrate GBA plus practices within your organization. So GBA plus is gender-based analysis plus, which I think this is a new concept for me, and I definitely feel like I'm very interested to learn more things from our two outstanding speakers today, and I will introduce them later. So first of all, I will talk about something logistic stuff for today's webinar. So this webinar will be recorded, and after the session is done, this video will be uploaded to our CIT's YouTube channel. And for today's session, feel free to send your questions into our chat box anytime during the session, and we will answer the questions as much as we can by our two speakers at the end of the session after their presentation. So I would like to say recently when I start to review our CIT and IT's journal and our CIT's translation talk, we see the topic equity, diversity, inclusions. They're very popular topics in our translation scene. So I can feel like this is definitely the popular topic we should think about more and talk about more. And fortunately, we have two outstanding speakers today to talk about the related topic and even the new concept for me, I think probably for a lot of our participants today about GBA plus. And we're gonna learn a lot from them. So let me just introduce our two speakers today. The first speaker is Chanel Greenaway, and she has over 20 years of experience focused on integrating equity, gender lens, and intersectionality practice into workplace cultures. And I know Chanel has tons of experience working with different, nonprofit organizations and even some like public sectors to apply the GBA concept and the related stuff for their group organizations and also like the other parts, especially for our translation. I know Chanel has a client with the City of Toronto, and she also played a very important role into the research and planning of the new 5-course specialization on gender-based analysis developed and offered by the Institute for Gender and the Economy. I know this institute is our big group in University of Toronto. So definitely we can learn from Chanel a lot today. And also Chanel worked as the lead of her own company, I think the consulting associate. And she also posts her website into our newsletter, and feel free to check and any information about that. Our next speaker is Hannah Rosen, and she is an intersectional gender equity specialist with experience applied GBA plus in the private, public, and nonprofit sectors. And Hannah has also tons of experience to work on in this field, and she graduated from Queen's University to get her bachelor and also her master degree from the University of Toronto. So let's welcome our two outstanding speakers, and I want to pass my time to them and let them to introduce this GBA plus concept. And definitely, I'm looking forward to having more information from today's session. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Young, and welcome everyone. Really happy to see everyone here and taking the time to explore the concept of gender-based analysis plus. So to begin with, I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. I know we're all joining from different places. I'm actually joining from the province of Ontario and what is now known as the city of Markham, and it is the traditional territories of the Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and Anishinaabe peoples. But as a general land acknowledgement, I'd like to reflect on the fact that we're all joining in from what was traditionally called and known as Turtle Island. First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people have for generations walked this land and celebrated their identities and their histories. And this all much before the arrival of settlers. Indigenous people knew back then and know now what it means to be a part of a connected community through their spirituality, respect for nature, and respect for each other. Indigenous peoples were and are the knowledge keepers that nurtured the land so that it can now nurture us. As we seek to learn more about Indigenous peoples and cultures, may we always be reminded of our commitment to steward the land, the water, the sun, and the air. And may we look to Indigenous ways of knowing as our guide. And hopefully we can all, through our conversation today and through conversations that we have in our workspaces and in our communities and our homes, we can all continue to strive to be in right relations with the first peoples of this land. I think, when Hannah and I deliver sessions like this and when we work together, it's so important to be mindful of the spaces that we occupy and the privileges that we both have. So I think, grounding meetings like this and gatherings like this in a land acknowledgement can be really powerful as a reminder of the work that you want to do, the aspirational goals you have in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So yeah, we are excited about our conversation related to gender-based analysis plus. I think I totally appreciate the great introduction that we had, so I won't say too much more about ourselves, except that both Hannah and I actually did work together on the gender analytics course that's now available on Coursera through the Gender and the Economy Institute at Rotman. So that's how we met, and we kept in touch because our passion really does lie in creating more equitable spaces. Hannah, did you want to say anything about your introduction before we dive in?
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Chanel, and thank you for that great land acknowledgement. I also want to acknowledge that I am presenting to you from Mokantisis, which is known as Calgary, just Treaty 7 territory. So I just want to say tanse to everyone, and thank you for having us today.
Yeah. So what we'll do is we'll quickly go over the agenda for today. We know we have an hour with you, so we're going to try to keep it compact and get as much content to you, but also leave time for questions. So the way we've structured this agenda, we're looking at the what of GBA plus. So, what is it? Then we're going to look at the why and the how. Why is it important? Why are leaders and organizations using this tool and trying to apply this tool? And how do you apply it? And then we're going to share a case study. And then again, our goal is to leave time for questions at the end. And we also have a few resources so that you can, continue your learning offline. To start with, though, we'd love if we could use the chat feature and just get a sense of where you are in your understanding of gender-based analysis plus and related concepts. So in the chat box, if you can respond to this question with either A, B, or C as a response, that'll give us a sense of where you're at. The first question is, tell us where you are in your understanding of GBA plus. First option is GBA plus is a new concept for me and I'm here to learn more. Option B is I have some exposure to the concept and practice of GBA plus, but I want to learn more and do more. Or option C, I have extensive experience and deep knowledge of the framework and applications, and I could lead this workshop. I love people who choose C because then we get to learn from you too. So I'll give you a second to fill that in. And it does give us a good sense of who's in the room and who's with us. I see lots of B, so lots of participants today do have some knowledge but want to learn more. That's great. Okay. And no C so far. Okay. How about we go on to the second question, Hannah? So this is the second and final poll question we have for you. Can you define and distinguish between equity, diversity, inclusion, equality, and intersectionality? So all of these terms are related to gender-based analysis in some way, shape, or form. These terms are often terms you'll see and hear in your workplaces. So we were curious to know again if you can define and distinguish between them. So option A is, I don't think so. I have a general sense of these concepts, but I'm interested in learning more. So this is where maybe your understanding is not so clear in some of these, because some of these terms sometimes do overlap with each other. Or yes, I can define and distinguish between these terms. Okay. I'll give a few more seconds for this question. I think from what I'm seeing, it's a little bit of a mix of both A and B's for this one. And so that's helpful. While we won't be able to go through all of these terms, I think we are going to focus on intersectionality because that's a big part of the plus in gender-based analysis. But we will cover a little bit around, the importance of learning the difference between and how to distinguish between equality, equity, diversity, and inclusion. So Hannah, yeah, why don't you take it over and let's start with the what of GBA+.
Perfect, thank you, Chanel. So I want to first get us into kind of what does GBA+ actually mean, because I'm sure many of us have heard of the term gender analysis or gender mainstreaming before, but maybe you haven't heard of the specific term GBA+ before. So GBA+ is a concept that was created and designed by the Government of Canada, the federal government, specifically at the time Status of Women Canada, which is now known as the Department for Women and Gender Equality, or WAGE. And so GBA+ is really used by anyone who works with the federal government, is receiving funding from the federal government, is in partnership with any departments of the federal government. So basically, if you have a tie to the Government of Canada for any reason, you've probably heard of GBA+, or you will have to use it in the future. And so I put the very specific definition up on the slide here because I find it's always good to kind of see these definitions up front instead of just hearing me babble and then being like, oh, wait, I don't remember what she said. And so I will read it out loud just for those of us who may be part of the blind community. So GBA+ is an analytical process that provides a rigorous method for the assessment of systemic inequalities, as well as a means to assess how diverse groups of men, women, and gender diverse people may experience policies, programs, initiatives, services, etc. And the plus in GBA+ actually acknowledges the differences between us and our lived experiences. And what we call that is intersectionality. And so now we'll kind of get into intersectionality. So I love this picture on the side here because it really paints a really easy way to remember what intersectionality is. It's basically, if you think of holding like a bunch of spaghetti noodles and then like dropping them on a table and they all kind of are touching and overlapping in some kind of way, that's what I like to think of intersectionality is. They all kind of touch our lived experiences, the different things that make up who we are. And so intersectionality is a term that was coined by Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw. She is a professor, a brilliant mind who came up with this in the 80s, actually. So it's not a new term, although it's gained traction in the past 10 years in the equality and equity community to actually be used as a practice within our work. And so intersectionality just means that we're kind of moving away from that single issue analysis. So we're moving beyond just looking at sex or gender. We're actually looking at the person on the whole, how each piece of their lived experience actually plays into how they may interact or experience a policy, a program, a service. And so the other examples of things that we might look at with an intersectional lens are things like your ethnicity, your ability, your age. And so me as a young white woman who is Jewish and lives in Alberta obviously has a very different experience than a Black woman living in South Carolina who is 57 and has 4 kids. We obviously would have very different experiences of the world and how we experience the exact same program or policy, because we have different entry points and different experiences to actually relate to them and use them. And so the reason I really want to emphasize how important intersectionality is because when you are actually creating your policies, which we'll get into later, and working through the steps of a GBA+, it's important to think about what pieces of your own intersectional identity impact the program you're actually doing and impact the way you see a GBA+. Because your personal identity and your lived experiences also impact the way in which you design things and the way you think about the world, because you have this very specific view of the world that no one else has. Everyone has a very different and specific view of the world. And so I'm just going to play this quick video that just gives a little bit of a description about intersectionality, because we know it's kind of a big and heavy and sticky term. And so we want to be sure that you kind of have a good grip of it before we move on.
What is intersectionality? Intersectionality is a way of understanding social relations by examining intersecting forms of discrimination. This means acknowledging that social systems are complicated and that many forms of oppression, like racism, sexism, and ageism, might be present and active at the same time in a person's life. Everyday approaches to building equality tend to focus on one type of discrimination, for instance, sexism, and then work to address only that specific concern. But while the career of a young, white, and able-bodied woman might improve with gender equality protections, an older, Black, disabled lesbian may continue to be hampered by racism, ageism, ableism, and homophobia in the workplace. Intersectionality is about understanding and addressing all potential roadblocks to an individual or group's well-being. But it's not as simple as just adding up oppressions and addressing each one individually. Racism, sexism, and ableism exist on their own, but when combined, they compound and transform the experience of oppression. Intersectionality acknowledges that unique oppressions exist, but is also dedicated to understanding how they change in combination. The roots of intersectionality lie within the Black feminist movement, with legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw originating the term. Crenshaw felt that anti-racist and feminist movements were both overlooking the unique challenges faced by Black women. She stated that legislation about race is framed to protect Black men, and legislation about sexism is understood to protect white women. So simply combining racism and sexism together does not therefore protect Black women. Intersectional theory is now applied across a range of social divisions and also to understandings of domination, such as those associated with whiteness, masculinity, and heterosexuality. Intersectionality is not only about multiple identities, and it's not a simple answer to solving problems around equality and diversity. It is, however, an essential framework as we truly engage with issues around privilege and power and work to bring them into the open. Intersectionality means listening to others, examining our own privileges, and asking questions about who may be excluded or adversely affected by our work. As importantly, it means taking measurable action to invite, include, and center the voices and work of marginalized individuals.
Yeah, I always smile at that video. I'm always learning something new or remembering something, and I think the fact that they emphasize that gender-based analysis or intersectionality is actually a tool and framework, and not a. It's not something that you can use to solve everything, but you can use it to help you again get to the outcomes that you're looking for. Is really important, and I think if organizations can understand and understands it a little bit more, and again practice applying it. There's no perfect GBA plus process or intersectionality process in itself, but it's actually the practice of it and using the insights from it that actually, again, help to inform your decision making in your work. So I think that's, one takeaway, hopefully that you received from the video and that hopefully you received from our presentation today. Just a few slides, again, building on that idea of why GBA+. I think it's so important to recognize, and Hannah mentioned this, that we're all living within a culture, and often an invisible culture that informs our decision-making, our behaviors, and our perspectives. And so when Hannah was talking about intersectionality and then starting with yourself and recognizing your own identities, power, and privilege, that definitely is a key point in terms of looking at what a process could look like, and again, what's your role in the process and where you're coming from. The other important piece, and Hannah, you can go to the next slide, around this culture that we all live in, is that it's important to recognize that our culture has been influenced by our past experiences. So the past experience of colonialism, for example, or of a patriarchy, for example. So again, these aren't things that we might not necessarily see and talk about on a day-to-day basis, but they are, again, influencing the way we think, behave, and act. So when I work with leaders and staff, a lot of people are sharing with me that they understand the concept of GBA+, but they don't know how to apply it. So sometimes they also recognize that we don't know what we don't know, right? And they want to use this tool to help them find their blind spots and to explore their biases. So again, in this invisible culture, there are biases that, again, we're not even aware of. How can using this tool help you move from the status quo and your default ways of thinking into a different space and into a different lens where, again, now you're not centering what are cultural norms and societal norms, but you're actually exploring the unique and individual experiences of the communities that you want to engage. Leaders are also, being very open and talking about wanting to do good and wanting to create change, but again, not knowing how to get at those insights and the data, qualitative and quantitative, that can inform practice and that can inform decision making. So yeah, GBA plus is a framework and a practice that, again, when applied and when practiced, it really can help organizations and leaders to explore how can we do things differently. Another point of contention sometimes is they know the theory, they practiced it, but how do you move into the action piece? And again, we'll show you a little bit about that, but it really is about committing to action, committing to testing, committing to piloting new things. And that's the only way you're going to be able to test and see some change. So it really has to be a fulsome process. And finally, the last point on the slide notes that organizations are turning to this because they recognize it's a tool that can be used to help with organizational relevancy and sustainability. Different people, be it funders, be it community, be it, again, employees within an organization, are really asking for products, policies, services, programs that serve everyone. And without being able to check your blind spots or explore new ways of doing things, again, you might be left behind. Just to, the next slide here, just to sort of emphasize the fact that that there are challenges with this work, and it's not easy work, it's messy work. We're showing this slide about biases to illustrate that what we're really trying to do is transform minds and hearts and ways of doing things. So if you just look at research that's been done around bias, it outlines 4 conditions in which biases are likely to appear, or which can trigger us automatically kind of moving to a bias, pretty much because it's easier to do. And so if you look at these things, and I'll admit, all of these things seem to be daily occurrences in my work just because of the way things are these days. So biases can happen when we're under stress. Biases can happen when we're under significant time constraints, so deadlines. Biases can be triggered when we are multitasking. So again, working on multiple projects, multiple activities. And the fourth one, biases can be triggered when there is a need for closure or decision making. So yeah, if you look at these things, I would guess and imagine that at least 3 out of 4 of these things are probably regular occurrences in your work life, maybe your home life and your community engagement life. So yeah, it's just another reason of why it's important to take that time to reflect back, to take that time to pause and stop and ask different questions. And that leads us to the next slide, which speaks to one of the important pieces about practicing a gender analysis and intersectional lens, is the fact that it prompts you and encourages you and reminds you to ask different questions and critical questions. So often organizations will come to me and they'll say, you know what, we believe we have strong diversity policies and practice. We believe we're working towards greater inclusion and that sense of belonging in our organization. However, we're still not achieving the equitable outcomes that we want. And we feel that while we're good intentioned, that again, we're not serving, as many diverse groups and populations as we would like. And I think that's been pretty much the case for many organizations. They focus a lot of their work and resources on diversity and inclusion, which is important, but it's not enough. And so I think with the awareness building that society has gone through since 2020, there is a movement now towards expanding their work in this area to include things like a strong equity lens, or a gender-based analysis lens, or an intersectional lens. So, diversity asks particular questions, and diversity is, again, a good place to start, but you need to go further. If you start with diversity, what you're looking at, who is in the room, how many different voices are represented. And so you are looking at, it's a little bit of a numbers game. It's a little bit of, okay, we've invited the people and they're here, but that's not enough. So once you invite them in, how are you engaging with them? Are you really respecting their lived experiences, their wisdom that they're bringing? And that's where inclusion comes in. Inclusion might ask, or might help you to ensure that underrepresented populations actually have a seat at the table. So they're not just in the room, but they have a seat at the table. Inclusion and belonging also ensures that their voices are being heard. So, and their voices and experiences are informing decision. So inclusion, again, you can see how it takes diversity a little bit further along the line. And then further, again, in terms of this continuum towards greater equity, we have gender-based analysis plus. And with this lens, you're asking even deeper questions. So you're asking, again, questions related to, again, an individual's unique lived experiences, and how are their identities impacted by different policies, by different programs. So questions around GBA plus could be, how will this decision or how will this process differently affect particular communities and individuals in relation to their own identities? It might ask, and you might look at, are we considering assumptions we are making about people's resources, abilities, and context, and how we're serving them? You might simply ask, will this work for everyone, right? And will it work in the same way for everyone? Who is missing, right? And so again, GBA Plus is a framework and a tool that, again, helps you to remember to ask critical questions, different questions that, again, can help you to bring up and help you to see and see your blind spots and address your blind spots as well. We can go on to the next slide. So yeah, Han, I think you're taking over this one.
Yes, I am. Thanks, Chanel. And so now we're going to get into the meat of what I guess we're trying to figure out today, which is actually how we can integrate a GPA plus into the work we're doing or going to be doing. And so we like to break it down into, in our opinion, a simple 5-step process. But of course, in practice, it becomes a lot more complex. It's always easier when you look at a pretty graph and you're like, oh, it's only 5 steps. I can apply this to anything. And then you get into it and you're like, oh, what have I gotten myself into? But trust us in that it'll be for the best, and you will get the best policy program service out of it that serves the most people. So step 1 is to actually identify and describe the problem. And so in this step, you really want to kind of figure out if it's something you're already doing or initiative you've already planned for. It's actually looking at who is going to be actually using this policy program or service, and is there a problem with how they're going to be using it, or is there an issue with access? So can everyone access it the same way? If it's something that you're trying to solve for, this would be like, oh, we identified this issue. Now we need to create an initiative or policy or program to solve for this issue. So those are kind of the 2 instances where you would start a GPA plus. And so when you're identifying and describing the problem, some questions you can ask yourself are, what's the problem I'm actually trying to solve? And I know that seems like a very simple question, but actually writing it down and putting into words, what is this issue? What is the roadblock? It allows us to kind of zoom out to zoom back in. And I really emphasize kind of that zoom out first, because when we start with a really narrow analysis of the issue, we're only able to see a very narrow scope of solutions that could be applied to this issue. And so when we kind of look at the broader issue and identify the bigger picture kind of issues and systemic things that are impacting the use and the experience with this policy or program, we are actually able to figure out multiple ways to solve for this issue and figure out the root causes of it, versus just kind of a band-aid solution. And kind of just the like add intersectionality and stir. We actually want it to be woven into your policy and practice. Another question that I really like to put forward is, who identified this as a problem? And this kind of goes back to our conversation that Chanel was just talking about bias and kind of what we look at when we're coming into these policies and programs, is because maybe someone who is a white man in his 40s might identify something as a problem, whereas maybe an Indigenous woman in her 20s might say, that's not an issue, this is an issue. And so who's actually identifying the issue as such, and why is that an issue to them? And that'll, again, unpack even further kind of where the issue stems from and those roots that are really creating an issue for you and moving forward. Our second step is to collect and analyze data. And this is qualitative data as well as quantitative data. And in this step, I really like to encourage community consultations. So with community consultations, it's really bringing in those groups that you identified in step 1 that will be impacted by your policy or program, both directly and indirectly, and those who the policy and program was actually intended for. Bringing in all of those people allows you to actually see, well, maybe I'm intending to bring this project to this group, but this group is actually using it more and finds it to be more helpful. And so this step will allow you to kind of make that data, kind of figure out where the problem's coming from an evidence-based standpoint, which again allows you to better get to step 3, which is designing and developing inclusive options. And so when you're in this step, I think the best thing to do is make sure, kind of, as we mentioned in a previous slide, that everyone in the room has different lived experiences and different opinions and experiences and ways that they've lived in the world. And why is this important in the design and developing inclusive option stage? Well, if you didn't maybe have the time or the money to really do a thorough evidence-based analysis of the problem, in step 3, you can at least do your best to ensure that those designing the policy program or service all have different lived experiences and are able to see this policy program or service from a bunch of different angles and are able to bring in that opinion to really shape something that serves the most amount of people. Some questions that I'd like to bring up in this kind of step 3 phase is what inequalities exist with respect to the issue and who experiences it. And I know this might sound like it maybe belongs in step 1 or 2, but in step 3, you're actually talking about experiencing it. So you've created your kind of idea, and now you're thinking about, okay, how will people experience this? And it's again mapping out who those different people are, what they look like, and how they will experience it. And then step 4 is actually testing or piloting the initiative, service, or program. And so in this step, again, it's really great to reach out to community and ensure that your product, service, policy, whatever it is actually being experienced by real people with different lived experiences and not just kind of a focused group of people that all kind of look the same, that all come from the same background, because they might have very similar experiences of using this policy program or service. And in this test or pilot, I reiterate that it's also important to still think of that qualitative and quantitative data piece in this part and in this step, because you want to kind of record what's actually happening, who's using it, because step 4 might actually result in you moving back to step 2 or step 3. And I like to point this out because although this picture makes it look very linear and very simple, sometimes you're jumping over and about and over, just like a leap pad kind of thing, through the steps. And there might be some steps that reveal issues in other steps, and you have to kind of go back and forth. And then step 5 is to monitor, evaluate, and course correct. And this one I think is the most where you might find yourself jumping backwards in the process, because you might find that once you've started, you're like, oh, this one group is really, like, we thought it was indirect and they wouldn't be impacted by our policy or program, but they're almost directly impacted and impacted negatively. And so you might have to go back and be like, how can we solve for this issue? Or maybe the intended group that you designed this for doesn't want to use it or doesn't find use in it or isn't impacted in the way you want it to. And you're like, how can we make this a more positive experience for the group we actually want to create this for? Which actually takes you back to step 1 of figuring out, well, what was our issue in the first place? Are we actually solving for it? And so step 5 is kind of answering your question from step 1. So what is the problem? Does step 5 actually answer it? Does our solution actually work? And so to make this a little bit easier on you, Chanel and I are going to go through a quick study, a little case study through transit, to be able to kind of show you what a GBA plus would look like in action. So actually integrating a GBA plus. So basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of talk about what each step would look like very broadly, and then Chanel's going to give you some real life examples of what that kind of looks like and who has put these kind of issues into practice and solved for them. And so as we talked about, step 1 is identify and describe the problem. And so one word to kind of explain this step is explore. And so we want to explore what the issue is. We want to explore how our transit systems are being used. And so in this case, we want to kind of analyze who is using certain routes, what routes are the busiest, are all routes being used equally, have some routes dropped off in usage in the last couple months. Why is that? And that, again, forms into the issue you're solving for. So in this case, our issue that we explored and that we identified is that certain transit routes have dropped in usership in the past couple months, specifically in times where it's dark outside. And so we've noticed that as an issue, but we don't really know why it's happening, because normally these routes are very often used, they're really quite popular, and they're on very central roadways, so you think they would be used. Chanel, do you want to jump in now, or do you want me to keep going through?
Yeah, keep going through. I think in the next one. Yeah, I think the problem is clear. Yeah, I guess maybe the only one thing I'll add is that, you know, sometimes leaders and staff will come to me and say, I don't know if it makes sense to apply a gender or intersectional analysis to this because it's gender neutral, right? Mm-hmm. And that's an assumption that people make, that they can look at something and again, because of the culture we live in, the invisible culture and our biases, you're not able to see and to recognize that, no, it might not be either gender neutral or, again, impact different people in a different way. So I often say, you know, the goal is to move towards a process and to create a process where we are exploring and discovering and trying to figure out, you know, what are the inequities here, where and how can we improve equitable access, for example. Let's not make the assumption that there are no, that it isn't, or sorry, that it is gender neutral, or again, doesn't, that the current processes, again, don't impact people differently. So I just wanted to put that in there. And so once you're applying this lens, I think, you know, you want to be committed to it and have an open mind about how different people are experiencing the program, product, or service.
Perfect. Thank you, Chanel. That's extremely important. I think a lot of us kind of in the past have heard that term gender neutral applied to projects. And in reality, it's very rare that anything is completely neutral from bias or inequalities. And so it's really important to kind of check that word at the door and don't let it come into your project, honestly. Just pretend that it doesn't exist. Wipe it from your vocabulary. And so in that second step, the word that we kind of like to use to summarize this is the examine step. And so in this case study, examining is actually, okay, let's get actual numbers of who's using this route. Let's see if we can identify what genders are using the route more. Let's get age groups. Let's get people with varying abilities, and let's actually record who's using these routes so we can better identify where this issue is coming from. Where is this lack of usership actually stemming from, and who isn't using our routes? And similarly, who is still very consistently staying on these routes at these times?
Yeah. So I've worked with a few groups here in Ontario related to public transit. And I was amazed at the lack of data on what I would say the lack of disaggregated data on ridership. So they have a general sense of numbers of riders and, again, frequency, but they don't know, you know, specific information related to particular communities, social economic groups, racial, ethnic data. And again, all of that is really important when you are looking at issues and problems related to accessibility or related to community roots, for example. So I think in this examine stage, it's important to identify, okay, you know, to identify and to, again, do that narrowing and still zooming out. I think you're constantly going to be doing that. So if, again, they're, in this case, they're looking at nighttime ridership, there's a difference between urban areas and more rural areas, or again, suburban and urban, right? And so who do you need to speak to? What data do you need to get? You know, what do you already know? Those are the types of questions and brainstorming sessions that you're going to have as you develop a plan for, again, doing that data collection and doing that examination. So again, you're going to want to cast it broad, as broadly as you can, but then narrow it down within, again, your scale and scope of the initiative.
Perfect, thank you, Chanel. And then step 3 is the innovate stage. So, oh, and Bo just posted that there's a recent report on this topic. Great, so thank you for that link. Everyone can feel free to look at that after, because that was great. I will look at it after as well. Step 3 is the design and develop inclusive options. I won't actually get into much of my spiel in this. I'll kind of pass it right back to Chanel, because I feel like this step is actually pretty straightforward to understand.
Yeah, I think in my experience, this is probably where the fun could happen and where the fun shouldn't be happening. So again, depending on the data you have and the outreach you did, this is where you'll get your cross-cutting departments or teams together to, again, innovate and to look at how can you do things differently in order to remove the barriers that were identified, or in order to respond to needs that you heard from community, or needs that, again, you heard from different stakeholders. So this, as Hannah mentioned, this is a space where, again, you want to draw on the data that you have, but you also want to draw on, hopefully you have a diverse group of people around the table. Again, if you're short on those diverse voices in either of those spaces, there's other things you can do. So I often tell organizations, don't let don't let limitations to, again, the scale of your work or who's around the table, don't let those limitations stop you from doing this work. There are other ways you can find this information. So look at other studies. Look at studies related to similar communities. Look at, be it academic, community research. So all I'm saying is it's better to get started and to test things, even if the process isn't perfect. Again, we're wanting to change the status quo, right? We're wanting to do things differently. Making those small steps and doing those small nudges builds momentum. So I'll leave it there for now.
Perfect. Thank you, Chanel. And so in step 4 is when you actually get to put the fun things that Chanel said into practice. And so some examples in this transit case study where, like we said, the problem is that certain routes are not being used as often at certain times of the day. They're especially not being used specifically at night. In our step 2 phase, we found out that it's actually women of color and young women that are not using transit at these times, and especially at late nights, we're finding that they're choosing to actually take Ubers or Lyfts and avoiding public transit altogether as soon as it gets dark. And so in that design phase, we thought about, well, how can we actually make it safer for them to use transit? How can we actually move forward and allow these people to have an affordable option that also benefits our city, benefits our environment? And so in step 4, we actually put these into practice. And so some of these things that might look like the city of Toronto has done some great things with, for example, their Presto card. And so one thing that they've done with their bus system is when it's late at night, you can actually request that your bus driver drop you off closer to your destination rather than the preset stops. And so what does this do? Well, it doesn't actually change that much. The bus driver is still on their main route. There's probably not that many people late at night on the bus, but what does it do? It allows people to confidently use transit in a safe manner that makes them feel like their necessities and their safety concerns were heard, addressed, and were fixed and solved, which is important to see that your city is actually considering your point of view and the way you experience transit into their processes. And Chanel, I'll pass it off to you to add anything else.
Yeah, I think we have seen lots of new innovations in transit. There's also, when Hannah was mentioning the Presto card, it's now time-based. So you actually, instead of being a card or a fee structure where you're going from point A to point B, it's now 2 hours. In 2 hours, you can go on the system, hop on and off as much as you want. That actually helps women in particular who, through the data, it was found that women often are travelers that do that hop on, hop off more than men. Again, it could be related to childcare issues, elder care issues. It could be just related to, again, the fact that women are caregivers and, support appointments and things like that. So that's one thing that was done. Again, improvements in the area of safety, and in particular with this case study at nighttime, there was right now you can request a stop that is not at a designated stop. So you can ask a bus driver, can you drop me a little bit, maybe one light further down, which is closer to my home. So all of this to say, and I think I can, I'm just mindful of the time, all of this to say that, yeah, it is about piloting and testing new ideas, new ways of working based on what you've heard from community and stakeholders. And as Hannah mentioned, step 5 is really going back to community, collecting more data, and or collecting data that you currently have and looking at data that you're currently getting to see what difference has this made. So again, it could be surveying people, and looking at, has ridership gone up at night? How many people are using the hop on, hop off option? And then you're just, those loops, again, it's not really a straight line. There's loops here, you'll go back and you might course correct or make additional enhancements based on what you've learned. So I know we ran through this really quickly, and we're coming up to the end. I think what I would suggest, Hannah, we did have a slide here on the preconditions needed for success. Is your organization ready? Are you ready? I think the important piece here is that you're going to want to identify champions in your organizations to help you with this. You're going to want to secure some resources, and you're going to want to, again, build up your knowledge and capacity around the framework in order to get you started. So I'll leave that there for now, and yeah, maybe we'll open it up for some questions before we end. Just going to look at the chat box here.
Yeah, thank you, Chanel and Hannah, and that is a great presentation. So I just see one question here from Anika. She asked, how do you differentiate between correlation and causation in step 2? There are often concerns that we are making leaps with the data in terms of who is getting impacted and why. How did you isolate the reason?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think you're going to want to look at multiple sources of data. And I think you're going at, with those multiple sources, you're going to want to identify trends, and you're going to want, there could be at some point that leap of faith in terms of what is impacting what and what is causing what. You're right, all of these things, this work isn't an exact science by any means. It's about information gathering. It's about analysis, and it's about, again, making the best decision with the information you have. So yeah, so I think my answer would be, again, within your resources, within your scope, try to get as much diversity of thought and diversity of experiences, lived experiences in your data. Look at other research, and then make your best decisions based on that, and then just keep on iterating from there. Hannah, I'm not sure if you have anything to add to that.
I think I would just add that in the GBA plus scenario, so when we're thinking about people, like real people and real lived experiences, correlation and causation, of course, is still important, but I think it's also important to think about, if we use the causation or the correlation versus the causation kind of tools or data, does it actually make a difference in the way the product turns out? In the sense of, are you still making a more equitable product? Then it's probably better. Are you still making a more equitable policy? Probably still better. So even though the data might not directly point to like A equals B every single time, you could say that sometimes A is related to B and B is not good. So we want to solve for B. And the only way we can do that is with this data. And so if you're in the end making something that is better, that is more inclusive for everyone involved, then I wouldn't be so concerned with the correlation or causation and more focused on the outcome and the impact of the solution you're designing for.
Yeah, thank you for your answer. And since we don't see any other questions here, I may have one additional one from myself. So after having, getting this presentation, I'm really interested about the case study. I was thinking sometimes in reality, when we see the problem identified, for example, we see because of COVID, and then we see the ridership goes down, and then we can think about, oh, we want to know the reason, and then we found that, yeah, because the reason relate to, GBA plus related issues, maybe a lot of numbers reduction is from, for example, like you said, from women, from like the time during the nighttime. Based on the experience from your experience in Ontario, did you have anything like right now your clients, definitely put a GBA plus application as like a required stuff for their studies or for their any projects. Or this still kind of like, oh, we identify the problem, and then maybe that problem because of the GBA plus related things. Also, I want to know, like, especially public engagement is really important in community, like translation community. So definitely we have those public engagement session, and then we collect the information, but also maybe it's like buyers. Did you have any experience, especially in Ontario, like how to improve the public engagement to cover this issue?
Yeah, John, that's a great question, and a lot in there. I think so. I think the first part is, again, why are organizations doing this work and how are they coming at it? And I think it's multiple reasons, right? So again, like you said, funders are now lots of funders are asking for this type of lens on their work because they want to fund organizations that believe in creating more equitable spaces and processes. Stakeholders, likewise, your communities, your partners are also looking, are also recognizing the relevancy of this work and the potential it has in terms of innovation and in terms of, again, serving more people. And I would say, thirdly, community is demanding this. So if organizations are not applying an equity lens and GBA lens, they're taking a risk that, communities will see that and they might take their business elsewhere, or they might stop taking, again, in this case of transit, if women don't feel safe at night, they might choose other forms of transportation, right? Those that can afford to take the Uber might take an Uber, or they'll form within their own communities different ways of getting around. So I think that's one thing that's been there. And I think the other part of your question was around community engagement, and was it around how do you eliminate bias in that community engagement piece, or how do you engage? Okay. So I think there's a lot of really good work coming out of the space of community engagement, and I think it's really important that organizations move from consulting community, from it being a very transaction type of relationship to a more relational process, where community is actually helping to co-design and to co-create. Again, Indigenous, Black, racialized groups, people with different abilities have been asking for change for many, many years. And we're actually now frustrated sometimes that we're being consulted or that we're being surveyed again. Right now we're saying we want action. So how can you include us and engage us in a way that we know that there's going to be action at the end of the engagement? So that's kind of the little parting piece I'll leave on that. I think we can do a whole webinar on, what does meaningful community engagement look like, right? And because, there is a whole practice around how you do that, how you engage, how you build good relationships. I hope that helps.
Yeah. Thank you so much. That's a great answer. I think the time is going to the end. I just only see one more question. So from Brian, I'm struggling with the confusion around if GBA Plus requires additional resources or not. My experience is that it takes time and effort, but I'm often told there's no cost since it saves us from problems later down the road. Can you speak to this?
Yeah, Hannah, did you want to start with that one? Did you want me to?
Sure, I can. So I think you put this in a really good way. You kind of answered your own question, which is kind of funny. But I think that there is a cost with GBA Plus upfront. So when you first started, and you have to plan for that. I think a lot of issues come from when people just say, oh, I'm going to do a GBA Plus, and then they get to it, they're like, oh, I don't have the resources to actually complete the GBA Plus. And when I say resources, it can be a bunch of different things. So it can be human resources, so actually having the people that have the experience and the time to complete a GBA Plus. It's not something that can be done in a day. It's not something that kind of gets done and gets closed. It has to be reopened throughout the project lifecycle. And so through that, you actually have to have someone who is dedicated to that. So that's a human cost. And then financial cost, you might have to, one, have money to pay the person who has experience in it. You might have to allocate a budget to do data collection or community consultations, to actually pay participants for their time and experience. And then time cost is a big one that people actually don't take into account. So people will take their project timeline and say, okay, it's going to take us about 6 months to get us developed and actually get this into implementation phase. And so allocating for GBA Plus means that maybe it's actually 8 months, because maybe you allocate an extra 2 months in there for that kind of course correction, for the community consultations, for adding in those pieces that wouldn't be there if you weren't taking in that equity or gender mainstreaming lens. And so I think you're completely right in saying that it'll save you time in the long run, and it'll save you costs later, because it's much easier to course correct as you're developing something versus developing something, being confident in it, having it run, and then figuring out it doesn't work, and then you have to start at square one again. And that can often be very costly in time, in resources, whatever it might be, because you haven't thought about it beforehand. And so it's kind of a thinking quick on your feet. Versus when you plan for it at the upfront, it usually results in less cost because you've planned for it, you've thought about it, and you've been able to do that throughout the process.
Thank you so much, Hannah. I think probably right now this is to the end of today's session, and thank you so much for our two speakers, and definitely our Northern Alberta community learned a lot from the GBA Plus. And I also want to say, like, thank you for anybody to attend today, and thank you for your time to learn something and communicate. And please put your eyes on Chanel and Hannah's research and projects in the future, and let's keep in touch. And we will have more sessions coming, and we're planning for the panel discussion in June, and also after our summer break, we may also plan to have some in-person events in the second half of the year. And just to put your eyes on that, and definitely we will hope you all participate in our more events and activities in the future. And thank you for your time, and we should have a great day. Let's keep in touch. Thank you.
Thanks so much.